Hi, good morning, everybody. This is Marina Steagal. It's good to be here with you today. Thank you for the ISS for inviting me. And let's start with some thoughts of love and comfort and peace dedicated to all those who are in Ukraine or involved with it. We hope that things can be solved soon. We hope that everybody's doing well and we can have a good start of our Sundays. For those who are here in Dublin, it's still morning. For others in other parts of the world, it could be afternoon or evening. So today we're going to talk about Allan Kardec. It's a name that's very much common, famous name in the Spiritist philosophy. And the idea is that we're going to share a little bit about who was the man, who was the method, what was his work, and his legacy. So hope you can see my screen here. So let's start with the man, right? Who was Allan Kardec? So for those who have been in Paris in the Père Lachaise cemetery, there's a lot of, famous figures in there. And you see Allan Kardec's tomb is always filled with flowers. There was an article in the French news saying that he's probably the most famous French person outside of France, right? So let's see who he was. Talk a little bit about his background. His name from birth was Hippolyte Léon Denisard Riville. That's how he was born. He was a scholar. He was a professor, an author, a translator. And later in his life, when he started studying spirituality, he changed his name because he had a lot of published books under his name. And he didn't want people to buy books because of who he was. He really wanted to then be focused on that philosophy. And he decided to change the name for that purpose to Allan Kardec. And he wrote 5 books, which we're going to talk about in a minute when you talk about his work, which became kind of the basis for the Spiritist philosophy. He was born in Lyon, in France, in October 3rd, 1804. He died in 1869 in Paris, where he lived most of his life. I showed you the picture of his tomb in Père Lachaise. He was married to Amélie Boudet. He spoke several languages: French, German, English, Dutch, Italian, and Spanish. So really somebody who loved studying. He was known for being a scientist and a philosopher. And what we're going to talk about in a minute is that he graduated from the Pestalozzi Institute in Switzerland. So if you look here, he didn't study Spiritism or spirituality for that long, right? So he started in 1855 and he passed away in 1869. But in those short years, he did a lot of work. So you see here somebody who was a professor. He loved teaching. He also helped people that couldn't afford going to school. He gave them private classes for free. So he was somebody who really was dedicated to knowledge and to teaching, which will be easier to understand when we talk about Pestalozzi, which we're going to do next. So the Pestalozzi method, right? In 1798, after the French invasion, Pestalozzi started teaching abandoned children in a convent. And he started to experiment with different teaching methods. So remember, we're talking about, hundreds of years, 150 years ago, where children were just, you sit them down, you teach them, and that's it. And Pestalozzi started to look into other elements. What about experimenting? What about vocational tendencies of the children? What about activities and instilling their curiosity so they would want to learn, right? These are things that today they seem, normal, natural, but back then they were revolutionary. And Pestalozzi has a huge influence in how we teach children today. That's why his name is still, you see Pestalozzi method still coming across and coming around, because what he did back then is everybody has the right to learn, and everybody has the right to learn through experimenting, through questioning. So before that, a child asking questions to a teacher in school, he was a bad child. Then they were encouraging children to ask the question, encouraging children to be curious. So in this process, they could find their own solutions, right? So that is something that became very iconic. And then when we go back to Allan Kardec, that was very fundamental in the way that he shaped his teaching, and later how he shaped his research on spiritism. So let's talk a little bit about science and philosophy, right? So we're still talking about how Kardec had his upbringing and his background, because his background had an influence in how he later, codified or defined the Spiritist philosophy. Science as a term, right, comes from scientia, which means the knowledge, is a systematic knowledge practice, and is referring to always as a scientific method. So is a form to acquire knowledge through research. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Philosophy, the word is a Greek word, actually two words, philos, Sophia. So friend of wisdom, would be literally translated, is the general and fundamental questions of existence process that through logic and through the reason of mind, you start to solve a problem, to be or not to be. You pose a problem, and then you start to logically elaborate on it until you get into conclusions. Usually it's very, very common in philosophy to use questioning, right? Of a critical discussion, and then through systematically presenting that discussion and then argument, you're getting to a solution. Pythagoras was probably the person who started the line of thought, very much popular in ancient Greece, that it still prevails in a lot of places where we see the school of philosophy, right? So two different approaches towards solving problems. And Kardec was both a scientist and a philosopher. So that we're going to see here, that he had a curious mind. So what was happening in Paris and many places in the world back in the day, probably in the 1850s, is that there was a phenomenon called the turning table. So there were lots of parties in Paris and in other places where people would ask questions and the table would tap yes or no, and some had widget boards or that sort of thing. And it was kind of a fad, something that was happening. Kardec wasn't very much interested in those things, but once he was introduced to it, he decided to study. So this is important to pause here to say, rather than judging, which is very common to do, say this is evil, or this is stupid, or this is that, or this is a fraud. He just said, let's study. Curious minds or researchers, scientists will look into something and say, let me understand. What hypothesis could I work from? What could be the cause of it? And all of that. Here are an introduction of the Spirit's book on the third part. He explains that in detail. But here he says, I just put a few pieces here to contextualize his thought process. He said, if such a phenomenon had been limited to the motion of material objects, it could be explained by a physical cause. So what could move a physical object, right? So just an external cause. It could be electrical current. It could be, some changing in gravity, or what could be the cause of it? So he went and looked into say, could something be stimulating these objects to move? Then he said the movements were not always circular. If it was something that would be causing it, there would be a consistency to that. It was very brusque. It was very disorderly. Sometimes they were violent, shaken. Sometimes they were dropped. Sometimes they were carried to a different direction or lifted and held in suspension. So that was, okay, the laws that we know in physics could not explain those things, right? First thing that he tried to say. Then he says something interesting to say, people who pride themselves on their intellect would think that those things were beneath them. Might say, I'm not going to look into dancing tables because I'm such a, renowned physicist, or, And he said, but a few of us were humble enough to admit that nature might not yet have revealed all her secrets to humankind, and they put themselves to investigate the matter. So here is also an element of humility to say, I admit that I don't know everything. I'm not understanding this, but I'll commit to go ahead and study further. So that gives you a piece of, how Kardec thought. So what did he do? This is the scientific method as introduced by Galileo. You ask a question, you construct a hypothesis, you experiment with it, you analyze the output, and then you can formulate your conclusion. That's exactly what Kardec did. So rather than just looking at the tables, he started to, at some point he asked the question, he said, who is talking? Because it cannot be the table cannot produce an intelligence response to something. So he said, who's talking? And the answer was a genius or a spirit, whatever you want to call me. And from there he started to say, well, I need to find out more. So he developed a method. He didn't want to be tied into just one person or just one source. He started to look around, and he developed a process for selecting mediums. You see that he worked with a lot of girls, young girls. There were two sisters first, and then others that and other people that, he, through letter, he started to select, to really collect the answers that he was looking for. So he started formulating a lot of questions and started to collect the answers. Then he developed a method for analyze the communications. So always against logic. So he would get all the answers, usually to consistent questions, and then categorize them, and always looking to against logic, against what scientific knowledge we had at a time that would make this, that could make this reasonable. Then he started classifying the communications. Of course, when you start communicating with spirits, there were all sorts of spirits. So he categorized to say, spirits of lower nature have foul language, spirits that are more noble have better, more appropriate, constructive language. So he started to categorize all of the things that he started to get, and he used a method called universal consensus. So for the same question, he would get 10, 15 different answers, and the consistent ones were kept. Okay, the 10 ones that are consistent we keep, those that are not we separate. So always looking for consistency in not only trusting one source, not only trusting one person, not only trusting, but always looking to, okay, I'm consistently get that answer to that question, right? So that's how he could prove that you can always be fooled by a person or tricked by a source. It was the consensus that made that, place. Again, he was always validating against logic, against, any scientific knowledge that was available. And through that, he could classify the information he was getting. In one of the translations of the Spirit's book by Professor Herculano Pires, he said in the introduction that Kardec's method became the method of Spiritism and has in its simplicity the guarantee of its efficiency, right? Because it's all through logic. So it was the first time that he started organizing such knowledge, because everything that wasn't, there wasn't such thing as a spiritist science or anything or science or spirituality. Everything was supernatural or a lot of mysticism around it. And he started looking at it in the same way that you would look at any science. And he explains that in a lot of details in the book. So with that, with quite a few questions, he wrote the Spirit's book, which is very well organized, cataloged by starting what is God, and then he goes into several. He talks about all sorts of things: the natural laws, the laws of reincarnation, and morality, and anything you can think of. It's there, organized in that book. So let's talk a little bit about Spiritism as a science, right? The Spirit's book opens a new area in the study of spiritual problems. Again, it will post anything in there. It talks about, for example, question 742, 743 will talk about war. Why do wars exist? What would it take for men to end it? What is a good person? And he calls here the term the water divider, right? Because for the first time, somebody introduced experimental research in the realm of spirituality. The supernatural became natural, right? So we think things that we don't understand are supernatural, right? Ancient people would think that rain was supernatural acts of God. Today we understand rain is just the way something that happens. We understand, the water will, different pressures and temperature consolidate, and it will, rain will fall. That is something that, same thing, the things that we think now are supernatural, like communication with spirits, are natural because they're part of a law as well. It came down of knowing the laws that govern the universe. And on introduction of the book, on part 7, Kardec says, we are addressing those who are wise enough to withhold their judgment. Very hard, right? Because we always judge things that we don't know. In regard to what they have not yet seen, and who, judging the future for the past, do not believe the human race has reached its peak, or that nature has turned the last page of its book. And there's an important thing here, that Kardec believed that religion and science should walk hand in hand, right? So neither God nor true religion or spiritism had anything to lose with the advancement of science. And on the contrary, could only benefit from it. So that's where he puts his scientific self in there. And for those who have read, or I really encourage you to read the book, even though it was written in 1857, it has a lot of good, science about the creation of the universe. It talks about atoms, it talks about molecules, it talks about thermodynamics. It will talk about things and how you could understand the laws of spirituality on that, from that perspective as well. Think about that. Darwin wrote his book in 1859, right? The Evolution of the Species. And that was super revolutionary because he was talking about evolution of man. In 1857, Kardec was writing about the evolution of the spirit too. So think about how, I always say, if I had read this book back then, I would not have understood a word, because today, with everything we have with wireless connectivity, electricity, things that we can relate to, is much easier to understand. And it still is a tough book. Imagine back then. So he was really a remarkable man. So let's talk about spiritism as a philosophy, right? We talked about the science. Now let's talk about philosophy. It establishes the principles, the philosophical treaty. It establishes the foundation of a rational philosophy, free from prejudices, of the spirit of the system. So he wasn't creating a new school, right? But he wasn't a rigid thing. And the way he writes is very philosophical, because he would say, okay, we live and we die, period. Either there is life after death or there isn't, period, right? So he kind of walks you through the logic process in a way that you read it, say, yeah, of course, yeah, I should have thought about that. It is something that, and that's the philosophical approach. And here and again, one of the philosophical forms is the dialogue, right? We know Plato used the dialogue, and it is the book is about questions and answers, and the questions are redundant, so the answers will build on one another. So that is how it's easy to absorb. Remember, Kardec came from Pestalozzi's school. And Pestalozzi believed knowledge is for everybody. And Kardec in the early days, had a lot of resistance, because people said, these people are stupid. They're not going to understand this. Just keep to the few of us who are more scholars, the scholars who are studious, and we will keep that knowledge to ourselves and forget the others. He's like, no, I want to write a book that anybody can read. I want to make this available to anyone who's interested. So he made it on purpose. He refrained from a very technical language to make it easy to absorb, right? That was his belief. That's something that he really wanted to do. General public. And the summary, right? Now we get to the work. What was the work? The summary if you don't want to read the whole book, If you look into the introduction, part 6, he summarizes what is the Spiritist philosophy. It doesn't humanize God, but puts him within the reach of humankind and understanding. Because there's always a dilemma that we have. We humanize God and then we don't like the God that we humanize. No, we still cannot comprehend God, but we can have a few attributes that we can understand. That God is eternal, immutable, immaterial, unique, omnipotent, and just and good. So that is what we can understand of God. God created the universe, which has all the animate and inanimate beings, material and immaterial. Spirits do not occupy the same order. So we're all spirits. So we're here, we are souls, we're incarnated, but we're all spirits. But we evolve. Again, the element of the evolution of the spirits. And everyone improves in different degrees of hierarchy. So the parts of the spirits book that talks about the hierarchy of the spirits, right? It goes from the pure spirits all the way down. And the morality of superior spirits is summed up like Christ did: do to others what we would like them to do to us, right? In other words, be good and not evil. And with that, he defines the principle of the good man. In the Spirit's book, there's a very long question, 919, that defines a good person, a good man, right? Somebody who's always trying to, understand himself, the self-knowledge, and then is trying to every day to correct something from the day before. So that is the good living. And it's his morality, the moral evolution that defines the character of man and nothing else. So he says, not the label, it's not what you call yourself, it's not what, the degrees you have. It is about, what good of a person you are. That's what. And he would say, you will recognize in a spiritist person by their moral transformation, somebody who's really committed to doing good and puts an active work into self-improvement. So now we talk about the legacy. Out of the Spirit's book, there were 5 other books. So there are parts in the Spirit's book that were then expanded into other books, and they became the basis of the Spiritist philosophy. So we have the Medium's book, which talks specifically about the communication with the spirits and explains all types of forms of mediumships and so forth, and gives a pretty good guidelines on how to do that, which is a very serious thing. The Genesis, which is about the beginning of the universe and how things were created and all of that. So the first part. We have Heaven and Hell, which talks about the afterlife. And we have the Gospel according to Spiritism and really trying to touch the morality of it. And Kardec said, look, there are many aspects of Jesus' life that gets a lot of, contention and disagreements, whether he was a prophet or not, how he lived as a man, if he was, the king of the Jews and all of those things. But one thing that we can pick is the morality. Nobody challenges do good, help others, forgive, and all of that. So he picked up all the virtues and compiled that and say, just get this, that we all try to, talking about the blessed are the afflicted and the laws of love. And that's what it is there, with beautiful descriptions and messages on the gospel, according to Spiritism. So what is the legacy, right? Knowledge and content that's available to everyone, right? So this book is the code of a new phase of human evolution. Again, is talking about how that spirituality can be absorbed with our, rational mind, and how can we, study through it. Is a fundamental stone, right? Is a starting point for Spiritism, because before that, the word Spiritism didn't even exist. And Kardec takes a minute because, as a proper scientist, the beginning of the book, he's creating definitions. What is body? What is soul? He talks about spirituality, but he says spirituality is such a broad term that it could be anything and everything. So we're going to talk about specifically Spiritism, which is the science of the spirit. And he creates the word, he defines the word, and he starts using it thereafter. So basically, in 1857, when the book was first published, he started this new era of Spiritism, which didn't exist before. He says, look, I don't have the ambition to say that I'm inventing anything, because since ancient Greeks were communicating with spirits, the Egyptians did. That's something that has always existed. He just organized that into in a compilation of those questions and then those books which really define what this philosophy is all about. And to finalize, Kardec showed us that supernatural does not exist, that the spirit is eternal, and we live in the middle of an invisible world that is always acting around us. So this is the summary, what I have here for today to discuss with you. Let me know if you have any questions or comments. And thank you for the time.